This week on Quality Digest Live, Miriam Boudreaux joins us to chat about ISO 9001 and quality manuals.
Plus, Congress points the finger at GM, but maybe the government should be looking at the mirror instead? That and more when we come back.
Today's sponsor of Quality Digest Live is Hexagon Metrology. Hexagon carries the widest range of quality brands. With an extensive support network, Hexagon is also your partner. Hexagon Metrology. We are metrology.
Welcome back to Quality Digest Live for April 11th, 2014. QDL is your weekly look at who and what is making the news in the world of quality. I'm Dirk Ducharme, Editor-in-Chief of Quality Digest.
And I'm Quality Digest publisher Mike Richman. Alrighty, we're going to kick off the show this week with an interesting news item showing how industry, universities, and medical centers can work together to improve quality and offer professional training at the same time. Seeking to improve the healthcare industry appeared recently on the MIT Sloan School of Management website. We picked up the piece and ran it in Quality Digest Daily this past Wednesday. Now, the story is an excellent example of the power of collaboration. The Healthcare Lab is an initiative of the MIT Sloan Action Learning Program, which matches student teams with organizations in an effort to work on some of the many complex issues facing the healthcare industry. In this case, GE Healthcare was a partner as well. GE Healthcare is developing an information technology tool designed specifically for cardiac surgeons and staff that's intended to foster better communication and process flows. MIT students acted as observers at hospitals during cardiac procedures to determine procedural inefficiencies, barriers, and challenges that this new GE Healthcare product might address. Now, this is a good example of the types of objectives that these student teams from MIT are working on through this initiative. Note that these are not medical issues per se, but rather quality improvements that don't require training as a nurse or a physician. In fact, MIT Sloan's healthcare certificate, which feeds this program and was launched last year, is open to any student in any MIT degree program. Educational institutions need to provide practical, real-world experiences to their students. Meanwhile, companies like GE Healthcare need people to test their developing solutions. And finally, hospitals need multiple levels of support, both in terms of tools and trained personnel, to ensure better outcomes for patients. Given all these needs, a program like this one makes a lot of sense. And we talked about this from a kind of a different perspective many times, the idea that industry and educational institutions can work together to provide training, real-world training to their people, to their students. And there's mutual benefits there. We haven't talked about it necessarily from a healthcare perspective. And you know, this is a really good, valuable thing. I mean, you think about it, again, MIT Sloan has their students get real-world experience. The hospitals get people to help them look at their processes and be neutral observers to that. And a company like GE Healthcare is developing a tool they're going to sell for profit, obviously. They get people to kind of test it in the field for them. It's really a win-win-win. And these types of things we're seeing more and more in metrology, now in healthcare. I think we're going to continue to see them going forward as we move along in industry here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've talked about it before. The more industry, whatever industry it is, collaborates with educational institutions, really the better off everybody gets something out of it.
Yep.
And also you're preparing products of the future, you're preparing the workforce of the future, because everybody's being exposed to something other than just some sort of academic regimen.
Get out of the ivory tower kind of thing. So for more information on this news item, and of course, as always, all the pieces that Dirk and I are going to be covering on today's show, check out the story links, as always, right below the video player screen right down there.
That's right. Well, I have a couple of 3D printing stories that came across my desk this week. The first one is from ASME, and I'm not sure if this is really cool or really kind of weird.
I think it's kind of weird, but okay.
I asked my wife, and she wasn't, oh, well, we'll get to it. How about a 3D printed model of your baby before it's born?
Wow.
In the fetus. Okay, sounds crazy, but a couple in California is
what a surprise.
Where else, man? Is doing just that. Katie and Gerard Bissett were looking at baby pictures of their own children when they got the idea for 3D babies That's 3D-babies.com. It's kind of half art, half science, but 3D Babies starts with a rough 3D image of the fetus via the ultrasound scans, that the mother gets from her doctor. Now, ultrasounds aren't exactly nice, pristine images of the baby. There's let's say artifacts included in those scans, the umbilical cord, part of the uterus, and so forth. So the scan really just becomes a starting point, but Katie Bissett takes the ultrasound images as well as pictures of the father, the mother, siblings, and maybe even the newborn baby if this model is created after its birth, and works with them in a 3D modeling software. We have some pictures here that kind of show you the steps. If we can pull up that first slide there. So you can see on the upper left, that's basically from one of the ultrasound pictures. And then it comes into the modeling software, and they're working through images, and you can see some of what goes on there. And the result is printed on a Stratasys UPrint SE Plus, and we'll show you what the finished product looks like. Oh, isn't that cute? So the little teddy bear holding the little baby. Now,
lovely.
Here's what I want to know. This all sounds really cute, right? This sounds, isn't that sweet? What do you do with this?
Yeah, paperweight.
Put it on the mantle? It's like, and I want to know, I don't know, I had some great, talk about something that you could use for like, when this child is, let's say, 13 or 14, and he comes home with his first girlfriend, introduces him, and you see him, Mikey, so glad you brought your girlfriend home. Terry, would you like to see Mikey when he's a baby? Here, you can hold him.
This was his negative 6-month birthday.
His negative 6-month birthday. Yeah, and she's sitting there holding you as you're sitting next to her. I don't know. I think as a parent, actually, this would be $800 really well spent because the torture you could inflict on your child as they grow older would be awesome.
Wow, is that scary?
Yeah, I love it. Okay, well, from inner space to outer space, according to several sources, including NASA, space.com, and 3dprint.com, this summer, the first 3D printer is going into space. NASA is going to be conducting tests on a 3D printer made in space, that's the name of the company, to verify that the technology and the materials work in zero gravity. It's an interesting goal. What they're hoping is that sometime in the future, something like 30% of a space station's spare parts could be 3D printed. So if you think about this, rather than to have to lug all these spare parts into space, which is what they currently do, just in case something happens, you take a 3D printer and a couple kilos of print material, and that's it. Now, you got to think about what this really means. According to NASA, it currently costs about $10,000 a pound to put something into space. So all of their spare parts that they're having to lug up there, they're paying for this, obviously. And it's in place of those spare parts, they could actually be taking experimental payloads. They could be taking something else up there instead of spare parts. So if they're able to create the spare parts on the space station itself, rather than haul them up there, it's going to actually free up that space for experimental payloads and stuff. So it's kind of an interesting thing. The idea that they're actually have this capability now in space to make what they need while they're up there.
Incredible. 3D printing. It's more and more coming to a space station near you.
There you go.
Good stuff. Thanks, Derek. Okay. Well, a short feature that we ran this week comes to us from attorney Dan Harris, titled 6 Product Liability Tips When Outsourcing to Chinese Manufacturers. It ran in Monday's issue of Quality Digest Daily. You see it right there. Now, we've been a little hard on lawyers in the show recently, particularly the so-called fuselage chasers, as we like to call them.
Last week, right?
Who can't even wait for the smoke to clear, literally, before pressing suits in the immediate aftermath of airline disasters. We've actually seen that happen. You're talking about it on the airline disaster that happened in San Francisco last year, where there was people were pressing suits before the thing even stopped burning. I mean, it's
Malaysia Airlines as well, yeah.
And so it's this has been an issue. But Dan Harris is a very different kind of lawyer than that, and his advice in this very different context is well worth considering. Harris is a partner of Harris Moore, an international firm specializing in the legal complexities of doing business in China and other Asian markets. And as such, he's well positioned to provide counsel to U.S. companies who are using Chinese-made parts or supplies. It's important to point out that original equipment manufacturers are legally responsible for all components of finished goods offered for sale in the domestic market. So pointing the finger and passing the buck isn't really going to work. So this advice is pretty practical. As Harris writes, there are 6 elements that all such OEMs must consider when choosing suppliers, especially ones from China. These are as follows, and we're going to show you a slide here that points it out to you. The first one is know your suppliers. Some simple background checks can reveal a great deal about a company, including past negligence and or criminal activity. Second one is quality control. You need to inspect components yourself in the nation of manufacture. Don't rely on the supplier or local governments to do it for you. So you need to have somebody on the site there in China, let's say, to inspect that stuff. Don't say, well, Chinese government's doing it for me, or the manufacturer, the supplier themselves are going to do it. Don't rely on that.
Yeah, you're responsible.
Recipe for disaster.
Yep.
Third one is history. If there's a pattern of shoddiness from a particular supplier, don't try to work out the problem. Dump them. Cut your losses and find someone more reliable before a small problem becomes a big one. Fourth one is contracts. Contracts, very important. Of course, Dan's a lawyer, so he's going to be talking about contracts. Contracts, understand and enable them to the letter. Enact them to the letter, especially when it comes to your responsibilities for inspection. Also, even if you're able to contractually shift some of that responsibility back to the supplier, U.S. courts are probably going to hold you primarily responsible for hazardous consumer products in the field. So make sure you
probably, they will.
They will. So make sure that you hold that letter of the law to the contract in place. Fifth one is insurance. It doesn't take the place of any of the above, but it's an important necessary backup, so make sure you have it in place. And finally, sixth, marketing. Don't make claims you can't back up. Dan used the example of one of his clients who's used the term toughest product in the field. Well, how do you prove that?
Right.
It's an assertion you can't really prove, and they got sued over that apparently, and it's an issue. So when you do your marketing, make sure that you're saying stuff that you can prove and you can back up. A lot of this is simple common sense, but it's surprising how often that's sometimes overlooked. This article is a good reminder that due diligence must be given to the choices that OEMs make with regard to suppliers, because again, the OEMs themselves are the one legally on the hook if anything goes awry. So good advice there.
That's right. Okay, you know, in the past couple of weeks, we have run a series of articles from one of our contributors, Miriam Boudreaux. These articles have actually been pretty popular, and the articles were called the Abominable Quality Manual, Parts 1 and Parts 2. In her articles, Miriam first describes how some auditors are essentially requiring a company's quality manual to simply regurgitate the ISO 9001 standard, which isn't something that's very valuable for the company itself, although it might make the auditor's job easier. And this is actually, it's something that the developers of ISO 9001 never intended. And then in part 2, she goes on to describe ways to construct your quality manual such that it meets the misguided requirements of some auditors and still provides value to your company. So here to discuss these manuals is Miriam Boudreaux, president of Miro Management Solutions. Hi, Miriam.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Thank you for having me on your show.
Oh, sure. Okay, well, let's get right to it. In your first article, you say that your quality manual does not have to mimic the standard. What does ISO 9001 actually require when it comes to your quality manual?
Well, actually, the ISO 9001 standard does not mention at all that you have to have a quality manual that mimics the standard. It gives you very specifically 3 items that need to be present on your manual, one of them being the scope, an exclusion, your processes, and also a reference or inclusion of your own procedures. But it never really intended to say you have to verbatim repeat this standard when you are constructing your quality manual. It does require the quality manual to begin with.
Okay. So some auditors are actually kind of backing you into, they want to see you, mention, which clause and which subclause and so forth, and basically are forcing you to do something that you don't really have to do. So my question is, why not just fight them? Why not just say, hey, Mr. Auditor, I think you're wrong, and go to the registrar, their boss basically, and complain, or go to the registrar's accreditation body? I mean, they're trying to make you do something that isn't right, so why not just fight it?
That is a novel idea, actually. I have been in this world of ISO for probably close to 20 years, and I've seen the trend. And the trend and the expectations are you're going to have a quality manual that pretty much regurgitates the standard. So I think when we go into an audit, there's so many issues that have to be looked at. It's almost like, what files do you really want to pick? And so having to pick a file on the standard is probably not one that you want to go after. but it is a trend. I mean, I have never seen a quality manual anymore that will really just meet those three requirements and yet don't look exactly like a mirror of the standard. Now, I mean, on the audits that I have been myself, I've seen the auditors say, you are missing point E, or you are missing this word. So it's almost like I had it, I explained everything, but because I was missing bullet E or I was missing a certain word, I pretty much could have a non-conformity. So would I fight that? It's an easy one to solve, an easy one to answer, so we'd probably just let it go.
Okay, so you're kind of saying you could fight it, but pick your battles. You've got limited time. You're trying to get through an audit, and is it worth the fight? Is that kind of what I hear you saying?
In some cases, that's correct. Unfortunately, and that's the reason why I wrote the article, because sometimes I felt like, oh, this is enough. You know, we already have all our manual mimicking the standard, and then I started seeing a trend that now our procedures needed to be needed to read exactly like the standard, and it's like, no way. So that's where I wrote the article.
Miriam, do you think that some of this comes down to, I hate to even say this, but some of it comes down to auditors just kind of wanting to make it easier for themselves? I mean, it's kind of easier to do that checklist, even though, you know, we all know that's not really what the value of ISO 9001 is, but do you think that's maybe the core of what's happening here, is the auditors are just trying to make their lives a little easier?
Actually, that is one part of it. That is true. I mean, it is easier for the auditor to see that you met all the requirements by just going through a manual that looks almost like the standard, and then kind of like a checklist. But also, I feel that in a lot of cases, if you have an auditor that all it does is audit and it's really a little bit disconnected from reality, then you really don't know. In reality, we operate a little different. In reality, this is not helping us. What is the value added? So that part is what I feel there's a little disconnect as well.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, the value added. So, okay, so you don't want to go through the fight. It's kind of like, okay, this guy's wrong, but I don't want to deal with it. So you say there still is a way you can tailor your quality manual so that everyone is happy. The auditor's happy because it's easier for him or her to do the audit, and yet there's still some value in the manual. So how do you construct a manual so that you keep everybody happy?
Well, that's a good question. So believe it or not, you're still going to have to sort of adhere to what the standard says. And now on ISO 9001, you have a little bit more leeway in the sense that you could change your words. But on API, which is the specifications that we're heavily involved right now, you almost have to stick to the script because there is a conformity matrix that you have to fill out. So because of that, I'm not recommending you go and create a quality manual that fits in one page, because really that's just not the trend right now. But in order to make it useful for you, I have companies put an introduction about themselves, put a really well thought out process map, but also one of the items that I presented on my second article was get your management team together and review the quality manual so they understand and they actually can give some feedback as to what goes in there. That part is seldom done. It's usually, the quality manual is usually the job of a quality manager, a consultant, or somebody, one or two people. So having everybody together review it is actually what adds more value, because you're going to see people coming up and saying, no, that procedure might not go in there, or reference this other procedure, or let's go back to the procedure and actually update it so it better reflects what the manual is asking for. That part has helped a lot. And you create a quality manual that is good and that actually could help a new employee, for example, get familiar with what the company is about.
And it's still something that's that the auditor is going to be happy with, because it still kind of outlines.
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, you take one section of the standard and it doesn't align 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. the auditor gets lost. I mean, that's another one I have seen, so it's kind of unfortunate, but it happens.
Okay. Now, Miriam, before we go, we've been talking about a quality manual here. It's our understanding, and you know, the ISO 9001 2015 isn't out yet. It's still being developed, but there is quite a bit of talk out there that the new ISO 9001 may not require a quality manual. That may not be a requirement for the new version. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, that was a really good surprise that we've seen on the draft. Unfortunately, the 9001 2015 is still a draft, so hopefully it will go out in 2015. I think there is a new draft set to release by June, so maybe we'll be getting closer to what is released. But it's probably going to be an improvement just because we don't have to dwell on the quality manual, and maybe we'll be dwelling more into the meat of what you're doing in your company, which is your processes and your procedures. So I like that. Unfortunately, for the people who are on the API spec Q1 and Q2, quality manual is right there, and those two standards, the 9th edition of API Q1 and the Q2, have just been released. So I doubt there's going to be a change on that side of the specifications.
Okay. Well, Miriam, our time's up here. Thank you for joining us today and talking about some ideas on how to construct currently your quality manual. If you want more information on Miriam's article, it's very good. If you just go to our look underneath our player, there's a link to part 2, and from there's also a link back to part 1. Miriam, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Have a nice day.
See you soon, Miriam. Thanks.
Okay.
Good stuff there. Always from Miriam. Always like having her on to give us some insight into ISO 9001 and what you should be doing.
Yeah,
with,
that's from the field.
Yes,
so
definitely.
it's interesting.
Yeah, it's good stuff there. Thanks. All righty. Well, we're going to wrap the show up with another article from Mike Micklewright, and this was a good one that ran on Monday's issue of Quality Digest Daily, and it was actually called "Should the Senate Call on Itself to Testify in GM's Ignition Switch Problems?" And again, that ran in Monday's issue of Quality Digest Daily. Now, this is a continuation of a theme, Dirk, that you might remember we started talking about last week, both in QDD and here on the show. And in our homemade article, The Invisible Andon Cord, which we talked about Toyota actually and took them to task a little bit for a culture of misinformation and deception over their tardy recalls of what they was referred to as their entrapped floor mats and their sticky accelerator pedals. That's been going on for the last couple of years. Now, we alluded at the end of that piece to General Motors as well and some issues that they had been having.
At roughly the same time.
At roughly the same time, actually preceding that even a little bit, because they've had their own issues and difficulties with some cover-ups, actual cover-ups, and delayed recalls in cases relating to faulty ignition switches in some of their smaller automobiles going back, again, more than a decade. The sad parallel, of course, in these two cases is that in both of them, dozens of consumers lost their lives, and those lives that were lost were directly linked back to these problems that Toyota and GM had with their floor mats, their sticky accelerator pedals, and in the case of GM with these faulty accelerator switches. Now, last week, GM top executive CEO Mary Barra appeared before Congress to testify and explain what happened at GM and why. Now, I want to play a quick clip here from C-SPAN. It's courtesy of C-SPAN from her testimony on Capitol Hill, in which she was grilled. It was over a 3-hour testimony, but we have one quick little clip here, which I want to play for you guys, which shows that. So, Christopher, why don't we go ahead and play that if we can?
I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. More than a decade ago, GM embarked on a small car program, and sitting here today, I cannot tell you why it took years for a safety defect to be announced in that program, but I can tell you we will find out. This is an extraordinary situation. It involves vehicles we no longer make, but it came to light on my watch, so it is my responsibility to resolve it. When we have answers, we will be fully transparent with you, with our regulators, and with our customers.
Well, there you go. And I think that Barra there kind of gamely takes responsibility for this issue, which, as she said, came to light on my and her watch. However, truth be told, she only came into the CEO position about 3 or 4 months ago.
Yeah, it came to light on her watch, but
came
it
to light on her
started much earlier.
Well, now she's been actually an executive with GM for a lot of years, so she can rightly claim that she was part of the problem. But you know, this again, this came to land on her watch, but it goes back more than a decade. It really first cropped up with the GM Saturn Ion, and then with the Chevy Cobalt. GM engineers and management knew of the issue, but did little to address it. And as I say, Barra was with the company throughout that period of time, and she only became CEO earlier this year. You know, there even was an example of a GM engineer who's been fired who said, well, I had no knowledge of this. Well, he signed off on this back in 2006. So he did know about it. He, from the evidence, allegedly lied under oath and has been terminated. And so there obviously is a culture there of cover-up and trying to take the eye off the ball from the government and from the consumers in this case. Now, Mike Micklewright reminds us, however, of a very key issue here. And it's alluded to in his title, that there was a partner. There was a partner involved in GM over this course of time. You may remember back in 2009 a little thing called the government bailout of the auto industry, where the U.S. Treasury Department actually obtained 60% of ownership of GM from July 2009, and they just got rid of that share in December of last year, of 2013.
Yeah, they weren't a partner; they were a majority owner.
For 3.5 years, where GM was owned essentially by the government. And again, the government just got rid of that in December 2013. So while this was all going on, again, this ignition switch thing really first began in the early part of last decade, but it was actively happening during this period of time. So Mike asks in his article, well, you know, all right, fine, GM's management needs to share their responsibility and own that, and Mary Barra took responsibility, I think, by saying that in her testimony, but the government has some responsibility in this too, and they probably, I think what Mike's alluding to here is that the government didn't want to be in the auto business, right? I mean, they didn't want to do this bailout. They felt like GM was too big to fail, so they came in and they supported them.
And yet, it's as part of getting their money back, the government getting their money back, they are riding herd on GM because they want to make sure that GMs are supposed to be, because they want to make sure that they get their money back out of GM. So, I mean, they are involved, or should have been involved, in the operation.
They are, but listen to what you just said. They want to get their money back. Their primary focus was get in, get out, get the money back. Were they looking at these process problems? Were they saying our engineering is flawed, where our engineers aren't doing what they need to do? Are they taking responsibility for it? And no, I mean, their focus was, let's get our money back. Let's get out of the auto business and recoup those funds, which they did in December of 2013, and get the heck out of it. So, you know, who had their eye on the ball? And there's another big issue here involving the government. It's not just the government ownership of GM. There's the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration.
Right.
I think that's it. NHTSA.
NHTSA, yeah.
That also, again, as I mentioned last week in the piece on Toyota, they're responsible for accumulating the data on traffic accidents and collating that, correlating it, and saying, hey, certain types of vehicles have certain types of problems. They were supposedly misled by Toyota. They obviously didn't do a great job with GM either in terms of getting into this and demanding the recall from GM. So, you know, there's a lot of responsibility the government has in this, and I don't think that, you know.
Well, the thing I think that Micklewright was pointing out, and he didn't mention NHTSA, but obviously Senate has brought up NHTSA. It's kind of starting to point the finger at them, but Micklewright's whole thing is like, well, why aren't you pointing the fingers? Why are you examining yourself?
Well, yeah.
I mean, you were the owners, for Pete's sake.
They were, and I mean, it's 3.5 years, and again, this issue's worked through over that period of time. It started before then, but obviously these were going on. So, yeah, who was accountable for that? Was anybody in the government looking at that from a quality perspective, or were they just looking to get their money out of the company and get that back? You know, these are fair issues. Mike makes a good point here that the government should be taking themselves to task a little bit. Maybe, I don't know who was responsible for GM at that period of time. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, was there a point person in the government who took care of that in the Treasury Department? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, so I think that there's more to it than just calling Mary Barra before Congress, firing an engineer that obviously was encouraged in some way to sweep this under the rug. Big issue. Ultimately, it's about accountability, and you and I and all of us are driving these cars and other cars, and we need to know we're safe.
Right.
And the government needs to help us with that, especially if the government is an owner of the auto manufacturer that's responsible for that. So, interesting story. This one's going to continue to unfold, I think, as the summer comes in here. So keep an eye on that as we go along.
Don't look for anybody in Senate pointing the finger at themselves.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that's going to happen. But it would be nice for somebody to step up and take some accountability.
That's right.
Okay, well, that's our show for the week. But before we go, we'd like to thank today's sponsor. Hexagon Metrology is committed to helping you control your processes, enhance the quality of your products, and increase efficiencies. They empower you to stay one step ahead of a changing world with their wide range of product offerings, nearly 200 years of expertise, and an extensive support network. Hexagon Metrology, where quality comes together. For more information, click on the banner ad just below or just to the right, as always, of this video player screen.
That's right. Okay, well, thanks to all of you for joining us this week. This is the end of the show, and thanks also to Miriam Boudreaux from Miro Management Solutions for joining us today and talking to us about quality manuals and maybe what we might be seeing for ISO 9001 2015.
Yep.
There you go. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you again next week.
That's right. Have a great weekend.
So long.
Bye.